Hello, everyone. Good evening, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us for another live Q&A. My name is Aveen Karim. I'm the Deputy Foreign Editor, live here from our newsroom in Abu Dhabi. I am joined today by Assistant Editor-in-Chief Rory Reynolds, our Jerusalem correspondent, Thomas Helm, our security editor, Thomas Harding, joining us from London, and our foreign affairs reporter Fatima Al Mahmoud. A lot of new updates since the last time that we held a Q&A in this format with this team. A lot of quick changing news just ahead of this discussion, actually, with US President Donald Trump saying that he held good and productive talks, as he described them, with Iran, and that he would be postponing planned attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure. But then we had Iran sort of denying that. Rory, can you talk us a bit? Oil prices have been something that we've been discussing a lot over the past few days. We saw a sort of difference happening after Trump's statement. Do you think it was indeed to calm the markets? And what can you tell us about the different, changes that we've been seeing in the market?
Well, firstly, it's hard to say where Trump was coming from with this statement, because if you saw his interactions with the press yesterday, he said about eight different things in the space of a couple of minutes. Where that he was open negotiations with Iran, and then he wasn't. He was sending more Marines to the theater, and that, but they weren't going to be boots on the ground. So it's been hard to keep up with where Trump is coming from. We even had Scott Bessent on TV yesterday, who contradicted a number of things that Trump said with regards to the war and the effect on the economy. Look, we will see what happens probably in the next 24 hours. Immediately after Trump spoke not long ago, Israel carried out more strikes on Tehran. So it's obvious that there's some lack of coordination there. We have known that for some time. More broadly, and sorry, I haven't answered your question yet. More broadly, from a Gulf perspective, Trump is, the Gulf states are very keen to see some sort of negotiation. They consistently called for the sort of more ceasefire language than war language. So perhaps he's trying to be conciliatory, perhaps he's trying to please everyone, which is the sort of thing he's done before. But I hate to give this answer, but it remains to be seen what will happen. But it is good news that this deadline that's been looming over us for 2 days, that would have led to apparently strikes on Iranian power plants and probably reciprocal strikes on power plants in the Gulf, it seems to be off. So perhaps, if anything, in the past hour, we've had this kind of this taken from over our heads. On the oil markets, it could be that Trump is under such pressure from the Wall Street lobby and the energy lobby to have some sort of stability, that he's come out and said this to kind of show he's open to conciliation. But there's a lot of unknowns there, and that's where we find ourselves at this moment in time.
Yeah, definitely. Fatima, if you can take us through what was said.
So basically, just to recap, we were in the newsroom today when there was a very significant development. President Trump had put out a post on Truth Social saying that very serious and very intense negotiations were ongoing with Iran, that he was basically giving them a deadline extension so he doesn't strike their energy infrastructure, and that decision or that extension was based on the outcome of these ongoing negotiations. And he was saying the meetings were going to continue throughout the week. Now, it's been a bit of a talks or no talks situation, because we also got statements from Iranian state media saying that unnamed Iranian officials were saying there had been no talks with the US administration, with the Trump administration. There were no talks with President Trump, neither direct or indirect, and that President Trump was just acting out of, first of all, pressure from the very credible Iranian threats, but also financial market pressure. So there's been a bit of a back and forth. We also have President Trump doing these media interviews and saying that Iran desperately wants a deal and that they badly want a deal, and they're very intent on making a deal with Iran. But then, as Rory was saying, it's been a lot of back and forth, and And a few days ago, he was saying they don't even know who to negotiate with in Iran after the US and Israel pretty much took out much of Iran's senior leadership. And you can see there's not a central figure that they can just call up and try to, negotiate with for an end to the war. And at the same time, the US president a few days ago was saying that they were not intent on having a ceasefire. So it's a lot of these back and forth that, has pretty much had an impact, not just on the markets, but also on civilians, I would say, and people who are very much affected by these events in the region.
Thank you, Fatima. And all of this, of course, relates back to the Strait of Hormuz. The US saying that Iran has closed it, Iran saying that actually it's not closed, but the ships just aren't able to pass. Thomas, I'm going to come to you. Just if you can, take our viewers through why this strait is so significant, the different threats that have been made, and also what would US action, we've heard Mr. Trump saying that he was planning to sort of gather a force to go liberate Hormuz. What would that look like?
Yeah, I think the whole world knows by now that about a fifth of global oil and gas passes through the Strait of Hormuz. So absolutely crucial to the global economy, as we're all discovering, with rising prices as a result of Iran, as you say, closing it. Quite easy for them to do so, to target tankers or large cargo vessels with their drones, potentially Shahed drones. There's other missiles that they have, and they haven't even got around to, it seems, planting any mines in the sea yet, which would cause further issues, as they did during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. So that's the problem that the US are facing, to try and get it open. They want their allies to help. That help's not been massively forthcoming because of the obvious risks involved. So the Americans have something called a Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is about 2,200 Marines who are expected to arrive on station in the Gulf of Oman probably towards the tail end of next week, and they will be operationally ready to go into action on April the 1st, around then. So that will be US Marines who have a large helicopter contingent, so they can be airlifted onto targets maybe in Iran or on the southern parts of the Strait of Hormuz, move their way up. They have armored vehicles, their own artillery, they'll have massive air support. This would be a proper land operation. It would be your boots on the ground moment, but it could be the thing that Trump has in his back pocket to unravel the strangulation of Iran has on the strait at the moment. So it could be a big development. Another set of Marines are coming, and they should arrive in mid-April from San Diego. 2,200 more. So you will have more, and there could be airborne forces too that they bring in who are 18 hours notice to move. So there are forces they could bring. It's nothing like the build up to the Gulf War in 2003, the invasion of Iraq. So, but it's something that he can do.
I just want to remind our viewers before we continue that please do send across any questions that you have for our panelists. Just drop them in the Q&A box below. And I'm going to start taking some now that came in earlier via email. A lot of them are related to the UAE and Gulf as expected. So Rory, I'm going to come to you with the first one. But please, at any moment, anyone feel free to jump in for any of the questions. How is the UAE proactively reinforcing confidence among global investors and residents to ensure that it remains a secure and reliable destination?
First thing they're doing is that they showed that they could safely get the large number of tourists who were here when the war broke out home without any sort of, without kind of any bother. So that, not to take people back a few weeks, but that there was an airspace closure, airspace opened up. They quickly assessed that they could set up these safe flight corridors, and suddenly hundreds of thousands of people could be safely moved out. And we heard the head of Dubai Airport say at the end of last week, I think it was, that about 1 million people have passed through Dubai Airport since this happened. So that I would say that's a vote of confidence at a very difficult time for the country and for the Gulf. I think the business leaders and government leaders here are realistic about what's going on at the moment. There are not going to be any tourists coming while the war goes on. I think they can still reassure people that physical safety here is the absolute top priority. Our viewers and readers have probably heard the statistics already. Something like 93, 94% of all projectiles are shot down, and the rest of them pretty much fall in the desert or the sea. There's been a small number of incidents of debris and a small number of deaths, sadly, but would, encouraging that it's not been higher. There is already, we already hear a plan for the sort of the day after the war. In Dubai, for example, the Crown Prince met with more than 300 CEOs about 10 days ago now, mostly from hospitality sector, but from others too, to talk about how Dubai bounces back from this. I think there will be a nationwide version of that plan as well to show people that the country is highly investable, that the sort of work it's been doing for the past 30 years is still valid, despite everything that's happened in the war so far. There'll be a lot more that we can discuss over the probably months ahead of us, but there will be, the government will be very strongly sort of putting forward its credentials that this is a safe place to invest. But I think they're realistic about what's going on at the moment. The tourists aren't going to be coming for the time being. The number one thing that they want is a ceasefire and productive talks. The UAE and the Gulf states don't want to get dragged into this militarily, and that seems clear as well.
Agreed, and most of the statements from the UAE have also been indicating that until now. Tom, the next question is, if the US has no off-ramp, realistically, what is the end game here? Of course, this is, a war that the US has been carrying out together with Israel. Is that something you can give us sort of insight in, but also just the different things that Israel and the US have been saying about what their war objectives are?
Well, it could change. I mean, and it has changed. At the beginning, we heard a lot more concrete stuff about wanting to create conditions for Iranian people to rise up and seize their destiny. And in the latest press conferences that Benjamin Netanyahu's been giving, he's still saying that, but he's focusing a lot more on the ballistic missile threat and the nuclear threat. In terms of a concrete off-ramp, it's extremely difficult to say because our own perceptions of the big threats facing Israel have changed as well. I mean, 2 weeks into the war, I just anecdotally could believe a bit more the Israeli military's assessment that we were getting every day, that the ballistic missile program, for example, had been greatly damaged. We were having fewer alerts and high rates of interceptions, less damage. Now, in the third week, we've been, particularly in the past few days, we've been seeing significant damage and a great deal more alerts than we had at the beginning. So I think we're in this sort of funny position now where the more concrete off-ramps that you could have imagined a week or two into the war now seem harder to perceive. I mean, if the US backs off, it's very difficult for Israel to carry on. But for now, I can't see with any certainty the conditions in which we can be sure the US might do that. So I'm afraid I'm only able to sort of offer uncertainty. I'd just say that the more the weeks go on, the more you'd hope there would be obvious avenues for de-escalation, the more elusive they seem.
Tom, actually, just on that note, if you could, there were, like you said, there's more alerts, but also the attacks that have been targeting Israel in the past few days have definitely made more of an impact than before, just the pictures and videos that we have been seeing. So if you can tell us a bit more about that, and, Israeli is also saying that Iran used its first, long-range ballistic missile in those attacks.
Well, so it's partly down to the damage, which points to the sort of fears that were even present in the 12-day war last year about Iran not, having inflicted serious damage, but having not necessarily used its most advanced stock. Perhaps it was holding back these advanced munitions that were produced in the past few years as a sort of tactic to exert long-term pressure on Israel. I'd say the other interesting thing that we noticed on Saturday evening, so at the end of Shabbat, the Jewish period of rest, was it'd been quite a quiet period for interceptions, and then suddenly people came out of the period of rest, and there were two massive strikes, one on Dimona and one on Arad, both in the south. Dimona, home to Israel's nuclear facility, and that had come just after the US and Israel, basically Iran's nuclear facility had been attacked. So it had the feeling that this was very coordinated, and that showed a certain degree of coherence in the Iranian sort of command and control, their ability to sort of think strategically. The day before, we'd had the same on the Haifa oil refinery shortly after oil infrastructure in Iran was hit. So again, it's going back to this point that like all these very confident statements of major damage that we were getting in the first few weeks of the war to the ballistic missile program, to the command and control structure, it's starting to feel a bit more hard to believe now that we can see some sort of kind of, a bit of coherence in their strategy of attack.
Thomas, tell us more about these capabilities that Iran has. And is there more of a fear? Israel has been saying this a lot, warning Europe that Iran has the capability to strike even further than Israel. Do you think that's something that we would see in this war?
Well, we've already seen Iran launch a couple of missiles towards Diego Garcia, a good few thousand kilometers away in the Indian Ocean. So those missiles got shot down, but the very act of doing it demonstrates that Iran has capability. It has launched satellites into space. So that means it has what they call an SLV, a satellite launch vehicle, that is capable of getting several hundred kilometers up into space to do that. So that is why the CIA assessed that, if it started now, it would take it 10 years to have an intercontinental ballistic missile that could hit Washington. So that's sort of 10,000 kilometers away plus. So it does have the capability. It does have these missiles. Question arises now in European capitals of whether they can defend against them, because the European capitals do not have the same defenses that countries such as the UAE has, which, to build on Rory's point of the 90-95% interception rate, is extraordinarily high. When I was covering the Iraq war, if it was 80% when you're on a base of taking out rockets heading towards us, that was considered quite high and acceptable. So there is good defenses in the Gulf. Questionable whether they have them in Europe. They're obviously changing that very rapidly. Does Iran have the capability? Probably.
Fatima, tell us a bit about, what we've been seeing recently in the Gulf, the sort of attacks that have been happening, what it's been targeting, but also the rhetoric that has been coming out from Iran. They say one thing, you have the president saying that they're not targeting their friends, only their enemies, but then the actions tend to show otherwise.
So similarly to the whole aren't there talks, I think a very huge marker of this war is, all these conflicting statements coming from all of these power figures, so to say. So I was saying, basically on the Gulf, the Iranian president has been very adamant and there's been a lot of repetition in their statements saying that they're only targeting US bases in the region and US and Israeli targets in the region. But the reality on the ground has been different, because we've seen attacks on civilian infrastructure, residential areas. We're seeing the death toll in the region and in Gulf states, increase. We've seen people die from debris that's caused from the interception of these missiles. So there's definitely a huge civilian toll of Iran's attacks on the Gulf. But it also comes to show this kind of power structure in Iran at the moment, because you have the president saying one thing, but then the reality on ground is that the president really does not have much say in the military operations in Iran, with the IRGC taking control. And, we've done a lot of analysis on this kind of decentralized structure that currently exists in Iran and how they're, functioning basically without like a central power figure, central power structure. So we have Iran on one hand saying two different things of how it doesn't want to target the Gulf and how the Gulf are neighbors and they're trying to maintain these neighborly relations when the reality on ground is different. And we have Gulf states, understandably upset with these attacks that are targeting their countries. We have Gulf nations, so far taking diplomatic measures to try and deter these attacks, whether it's by closing off Iranian embassy or declaring its staff non grata or expelling its ambassadors. So we have UAE did that earlier on. We have Qatar and Saudi Arabia follow suit not too long ago. So it's a very a volatile situation currently on ground. So yeah.
And this brings me to one of the questions that we have, Rory, on what specific measures has the UAE implemented to ensure rapid response and protection against missile or drone threats within its borders, which you may have already kind of answered, you and Thomas Hardy, but if there's anything further, and also just similar to that, if you could elaborate on how the UAE is strengthening its defense capabilities while still maintaining its partnership with the US. So I guess one for you, Thomas.
I can jump in on that one. Thanks, Ving. Yes, so there's been a quite significant announcement just the end of last week of $8 billion purchase by the UAE of American defensive equipment and a few offensive items as well, but mainly radars for the THAAD interceptors, but it is also, broadly speaking, a much wider radar system that can integrate all the different elements in a layered defense, from fighters to intercept drones and cruise missiles, to intercept missiles like THAAD, like Patriot, to close in on-point support such as machine guns or the drone interceptors that have been much talked about that have come from potentially Ukraine or will come from Ukraine. So there's a lot of investment going into really making it a network defense system. So new radars, new sort of ways of communicating, new mobile point defense systems. So that this is going to reinforce the defenses in the UAE. And I think that the Ukraine element to this is a really important one, in that they have learned heaps. I mean, they got 135 Shahed drones attacked yesterday and barely registered on the news cycle, but they dealt with it.
Yeah, that's true. Rory, do you want to continue? Thanks, Thomas.
I think the US sort of resupply deal is very significant, as Thomas says, because it's shown that they can very quickly get State Department and Congress to get behind, the war kind of material that the UAE needs. And actually, it was announced publicly very quickly, which doesn't always happen with defense deals. Sometimes it's very much in the background until the last minute. So it seemed to be done very quickly. I don't know how quickly the sort of the materials will get to the UAE, but they've shown that the defense is the absolute paramount here. So, I mean, the other thing I was going to talk about is the continued threat to power plants and desalination, which was originally sparked by the Trump sort of threat in the early hours of Saturday, and we had this sort of deadline 4 a.m. tomorrow morning. Again, it remains to be seen what will happen, but there's been a lot of concern about civilian power plants and water treatment facilities being struck, and so far those haven't been struck. And I think perhaps the prospect of them being targeted, the message has got through to Trump that these are absolutely critical. And once someone starts knocking out Iran's water, Iran will be tempted to attack the Gulf states' water, and it's a sort of spiral into, sort of chaos. So, of all the times that there's been a point to step back in this war so far, it seems that this has been one of them. Again, we will see what happens, but the Trump saying he won't strike Iran's power plants seems to be the sort of bit of green shoots of good news that we needed today.
And on that, actually, on whether Trump would back down or not, we have a question that ties into that. will Israel continue the war on Iran or Hezbollah even if Donald Trump backs off? Tom, I guess that's one for you.
I think harder to see it continuing the war on Iran because it's such a huge enemy. It would be such a huge fight that Israel, a very small country, would have to continue. Lebanon's very different. Israel's fought Hezbollah many times, and it sees, it's a threat that rather than being a long distance is right on the borders. And in the last fight with Hezbollah throughout the Gaza war, that region of Israel had been emptied of its civilian population. The big difference now is that all those civilians are still there. So Israel really feels an urgency to protect them and also to avoid this sort of humiliating prospect of masses of Israelis feeling that they need to move south, because when that happened in the Gaza war, it was viewed as a humiliation of Israel's security. I'd say that also the type of fighting that we're seeing from the Israelis in southern Lebanon points to a sort of occupation of the region. We're seeing major attacks on its infrastructure, vast displacement orders, bombing of southern Lebanon, but also Beirut. So I think, the evidence suggests now that even if the Iran war to wrap up, it's far from certain. I'd say it's more likely that the war with Hezbollah or the war in southern Lebanon, which includes bombings throughout the country, would carry on.
And on Lebanon, because of course that's been somewhere where this war has expanded. Whether it would have happened without the war on Iran or not is a different argument. One of the questions, Fatima, is what are the political expectations for the next few weeks from the Lebanese government point of view? But if not from the Lebanese government point of view, then from the point of view of someone who is Lebanese and also covering the situation.
I would say, I agree with what Tom was saying, is that the Lebanon front is definitely unrelated for Israel because they have the capacity and the manpower and the goals, the military goals that they are keen on achieving in South Lebanon and in Lebanon in general. My sort of analysis, honestly, and I think it's pretty obvious one, is Lebanon is genuinely stuck between a rock and a hard place. You have, the Lebanese government on one hand had this, as part of their ceasefire deal with Israel in November 2024, it was on the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah, to bring all weapons under state control. And the government and the cabinet had been saying that that was achieved in south of the Litani River and that they were working on the plan and that they just needed a bit more time because Hezbollah's weapons in Lebanon are sort of a very sensitive issue internally in the country, and there was always these fears of driving the country into civil war and internal strife. So that was on one hand one scenario where the Lebanese government was trying to fulfill its part in the ceasefire deal, but also sort of strike that balance to keep internal calm without, you don't want to jump into civil war either. They're trying to maintain calm everywhere. And then on the other hand, you have Israel, who is now just refusing to negotiate or speak to the Lebanese. The US sort of like just sidelining Lebanon at the moment because Israel thinks that the Lebanese cabinet did not do its part in the ceasefire deal, and now it wants to take matters into its own hands and disarm Hezbollah on its own. But at the end of the day, Israel has been, it's been intensifying its attacks, it's been expanding its attacks as sort of a pressure method on the Lebanese government and on the Lebanese society and community. But they say one thing, while in reality, they're also targeting civilian infrastructure. They issue these warnings to ambulances and health facilities, which under international law, regardless of their affiliation, are civilian infrastructure and are protected by international law. They've also been increasingly targeting bridges in South Lebanon. Now, Israel claims these bridges are used by Hezbollah to transport weapons to the south, but at the same time, these bridges are also civilian infrastructure. They're like a lifeline for people of the south, residents who are still in the south. They're escape routes in case things, deteriorate. They provide them with aid, basic services, food, medicine. So it's a very tricky situation for Lebanon at the moment. The Lebanese government is doing its part. It's calling for direct talks and direct negotiations with Israel, something that had been taboo for the past decades in Lebanon's history. But now they're trying to do whatever they need to do to kind of end this war, end this violence, and bring people back home. But on the other hand, you have Israel pushing, like Tom said, for a potential ground invasion, increasing fears of occupation, or at the very least, Israel's trying to build a buffer zone south of the Litani, which is almost 8% of Lebanon's territory. So it really is a rock and a hard place situation for Lebanon.
Before I move on back to the Gulf and to weapons, just on Lebanon and Israel's expansionist actions in the region, one of the questions is, do the journalists, so all of you can answer this, do the journalists view the Israeli ambition to be a greater Israel?
Well, I'll have a go at this massive question. I mean, any treatment of this question has to start with the sort of obvious tactical difficulties. I mean, Greater Israel is from Sinai to Iraq. So the fact that Israel has been bogged down in occupations of southern Lebanon in its history points to just the immediate sort of tactical difficulty of this. I'd also say that, while there are sort of high-profile people on the Israeli right who talk about it, the preoccupation for most of, let's say, the sort of messianic settler movement now, the immediate priority, is still the West Bank, and to a slightly smaller degree, Gaza. The West Bank is full of Jewish archaeological sites. There's also a security argument among these people about the importance of taking it. So, and when the National's done sort of work on people who are pushing for a kind of biblical Israel, we speak to people who are very into it, but they're always kind of viewed by mainstream far-right settlers as slightly eccentric, because, why would you be focusing on Iraq when we've still got to take the West Bank, kind of thing. That being said, the fact that we're even having this conversation is hugely significant, and I think, and while I want to stress the sort of tactical difficulties of seeing this, a few days before the war broke out with Iran, Yair Lapid, the centrist leader of Israel, was asked a question along these lines. And the answer he gave, which basically pinned him down on what his vision of Zionism was and whether it was a biblical one, he couldn't quite give a direct answer to say, no, we don't believe in Greater Israel. I think the fact that the centrist leader of Israel can't distance himself from this as a concept shows quite how much the past few years under this far-right Israeli government has shifted the narrative. And this is an image that is not just a debate within Israel, but is something that the rest of the world sees, and particularly the Middle East. And it builds this sense that Israel is going down an extremely messianic and sort of terrifying path. So while I think there are, big limitations to us seeing this, I absolutely sympathize with people who are very scared at the sort of sound bites that they see coming from Israel.
I mean, just to add to that, and I'm not an Israel expert, but we often try to put logic to what Israel does and actually what Iran does. But on a number of occasions in the past couple of years, Netanyahu, Aragchi, Pezeshkian, GC have all acted in a way that's hard to put logic to. It's often sort of one step forward, two steps back, sort of thing. So it's hard to figure out, where next for the Netanyahu regime, where next for his government and their allies. But it's a very good point by Tom. The entire debate, the entire calculus has shifted in the space of a very short space of time.
Yeah, agreed. Very good points, Tom. And yeah, good reference to Yair Lapid, who was seen by many as a more of a moderate, let's say, voice coming out of Israel. There's a few questions relating to the same thing, so I'll take one which addresses it, and I hope this will answer all of them. Rory, what support measures will the UAE or has the UAE put in place to support the economy? And what of the real estate and hospitality sectors, which there's been a lot of questions about that as well.
Yeah, this is a big talking point here, and a big story as well. So tourism and hospitality is about 10% of UAE GDP. Close to 1 million people of about 11 million work in this sector. And there have been job losses. There's been people placed on kind of reduced salaries or sort of almost kind of furloughed or encouraged to take their holidays, for example. So how to kind of rescue the hospitality sector has become a big story here. As I was mentioning before, with some frankness, I think we know it'll be a while before tourists come back. That's not to say there won't be a plan to sort of jumpstart that part of the economy. For now, as I mentioned, there's been meetings with hospitality leaders, and they'll be thinking about how to bounce back. It's possible we might see some sort of government stimulus for small businesses. We did see a number of provisions during COVID where the government sort of slashed the cost of hiring people and visas and the sort of license fees you pay to be a business here. A lot of people think the UAE is completely tax-free. That's not entirely true. Businesses pay tax and they pay money to operate here. It is entirely possible that they will be looking at something along those lines as they have before. I think also the kind of messaging that the country gives out will be important once the war's over. It seems highly likely that there will be a very strong message, as there is already actually, that this is a very resilient place. The people are very resilient. This is still a land of opportunity for many. And before the war happened, the fundamentals were extremely strong. I mean, the non-oil economy was the strongest it's ever been. The number of small businesses that have started up it's been huge, in the hundreds of thousands. So, there aren't specific examples I can give you yet of, sort of cash injections. That hasn't happened yet. But there will certainly be a plan for the UAE to bounce back very strongly. And I think we'll start to see that in the kind of key messaging coming out and the advertising and marketing coming out. They will be very keen to get those sort of visitors back. As far as the hospitality industry goes specifically, I think people are speaking with some frankness that there will be short-term pain, but that everything's been done to kind of mitigate, the industry declining here, and I think we will see a bounce back.
And another question that we have, and I think we get it quite often, and I will always go to Thomas for that one, is on the capabilities for anti-ballistic defense missiles. Does the UAE have sufficient supplies? But I guess this is not a question just for the UAE, but for the wider Gulf and even Israel.
Yeah, I mean, there is a finite supply of Patriot and THAAD missiles interceptors. I mean, that's very obvious. There's only so many that the US defense industry can generate. Hence why the necessity to take out the Shahed drones with something that can be mass produced, like the interceptors that Ukraine and other countries, Latvia as well, we reported on, have developed and proven in the battlefield. So you're getting a $2,000 sort of spike interceptor taking out a $30,000 Shahed drone. So that is important, and people will be able to use cheaper. The military will use cheaper interceptors to take out drones, and fighters do it at a relatively low cost as well. There's RAF fighters covering the bases in Qatar and covering the Bahrain, Qatar, and UAE. So you've got that element to it. They will reserve the more expensive items for the bigger threats. So I think it will be a priority. America has taken out Patriots from South Korea to redeploy in the region. So there is material there that can be done in an emergency. Ukraine might suffer from not getting Patriots, but it's got other methods of dealing with this.
That's actually something maybe I'm sure a lot of people would be curious in, this expertise that Ukraine has offered to share with the Gulf. What is the mechanism of how does their interception, the methods that they've come up with for the Shahed drones, how does it work exactly?
So it's what you call a layered defense. So you have an anti-defense. You need the radars to pick up the targets, the The drones, Shaheds, are relatively straightforward. They on a course. They are not as yet got AI capability to do evasive tactics. So when they're set on a course, they're traveling at 185 kilometers per hour. So you know where they're heading. Now the layered defense, as I said, would be the fighters at the one end, but close in point defense, as you call it, within less than 10 kilometers to a few hundred meters. You would be looking at attack helicopters, something the UAE has already adapted using the cannon on board there. To actually intercept it, you need to sort of take out its nose cone or any part of it, really, its wings. But so that can be done with machine gun fire. You can use radar to bring very accurate heavy cannon or machine gun fire onto the target and take it out of the sky. So and the Ukrainians have really evolved this. It's a really networked defense that they can roll in and deal with whatever's being fired at them. Some do get through, but the majority are taken out.
One other question, I guess this is something that a lot of countries have implemented, especially at a time of conflict, on the prohibition of taking photographs of incoming projectiles and sharing them on social media. Should there be an exception? That's something that's in place here in the region. I believe in Israel as well. I think Ukraine also has that. Roy, is that something you can answer?
We've a lot of the countries in the region have now brought in very strict rules on taking pictures of whether it's interceptions or military planes or vehicles moving around and sharing it on social media. There's obviously a lot of interest in this. So I think in the UAE, by way of example, I think in the first week or so, the authorities were kind of warning people, telling people, please don't share this footage. Firstly, because it could give away, the exact locations of what is attempting to be hit or where jets are being sent. And also, secondly, because it generates quite a lot of fear and panic. And although there is an argument that in this day and age, everything should be documented, there's also an argument that it could make the situation worse. So after about a week of this, the UAE started taking quite strict action. They've sort of called in a number of people for sort of questioning. There's been a number of people prosecuted, but there's sort of a sliding scale of severity. I mean, certainly we've heard of people being asked to delete videos from their phones, and that be the end of it. There's also been a number of people who've been arrested for going sort of some steps further and like generating AI footage that's deliberately misleading. And that's obviously been taken more seriously. I mean, that's setting out to hamper the war effort, you might say. So I think it is that sort of end of the scale that's being taken more seriously. We've actually seen most countries in the region, I think even Iraq have introduced this. Yeah. And we were talking earlier, I mean, in some cases it's hard to police, in some cases not. But and Israel has had very strict rules around defense and indeed media, the way that media can report goings on related to the military. So it's become quite common now in the age of social media to try to have something of a handle on what's getting out. So
I think it's also important to emphasize it's not just sort of the Middle East that has these practices in place. In the Afghanistan war, when I was out there, from a number of operations with British forces, you had operational security control over what you could photograph and generally what you could report, but they would not allow pictures of wounded British soldiers to be published. Similarly, in the Blitz in London or during all the Second World War, there was a propaganda ministry that would not allow anything to be published that might impact the public good. This is a country at war. It's I'm afraid it's one of the fallouts from a conflict. It's control of information that could be useful to the enemy.
Thank you. One question here. It's an interesting one. I'll leave it out in the open. Given that the US is currently sustaining an unbudgeted burn rate of roughly $1.4 billion per day, while Iran's economy is facing a near total collapse of its oil revenue. Which side is more likely to hit a hard breaking point first? I guess between the US and Iran. Anyone?
Do you want to take that?
Who, me? Well, I think the Americans are burning through a lot of stocks at the moment. That is for sure. It's like in between 900 and 1.4 billion dollars a day. Really significant amount. We don't know what they've got in their stockpile. A lot has been defensive stuff was given to Ukraine. They probably a lot have been given to Israel as well. So we honestly don't know what their stockpile is. We don't know what the state of the Iranian economy is and how long they can actually last. You know, sometimes you just take a look behind the curtain and you go, this could be a regime on the point of collapse. Evidently, it's not the case at the moment. They're able to communicate. They're able to fire missiles at Diego Garcia, as we mentioned. So there is a finite line here of one side will run out of something at some point. But I think America's industrial base is pretty significant.
Mm.
There was this extraordinary figure that came out the other day, which was the administration was going to ask Congress for 200 billion, justify this war. And I think that's, firstly, unpalatable to the American people and probably a lot of Republican politicians. But I think it was one of these gestures that the administration does, like, look how far we're willing to go to crush Iran. I don't think it's viable for America to spend that level of money on this conflict. But again, they say one thing and sort of see another.
Well, Kirsty Noem just spent $220 million on an advertising campaign. So,
In the age of Doge as well, unthinkable.
Yeah.
I'll come to Fatima and Tom. Chunky question on Lebanon and Israel. With current diplomatic efforts seemingly focused on the direct tensions between the US, Israel, and Iran, there is a growing concern regarding the perceived deprioritization of the Lebanese front. So I guess is there a diplomatic framework currently in place to ensure Lebanon is not excluded from a comprehensive regional de-escalation? But I guess a solution in Lebanon would probably be separate to the one between Israel and Iran, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I would say, we heard from Iranian officials that, at least from Iran, that a war or a ceasefire in Iran would also include an end to the war in Lebanon. So they do have Lebanon in mind as like an end to hostilities. Trump's Truth Social post today did mention that they were looking at an end to hostilities in the region. But again, this is all talk and this is all he said, she said. And like we said at the start of the session, there's been a lot of back and forth. I think the most concrete efforts being put into a Lebanon ceasefire is being done by France. I would say France is pushing for, some kind of diplomatic solution, pushing for talks, pushing for just some kind of attention to the crisis in Lebanon. But I think, unfortunately, at least my reading of the situation at the moment is Lebanon is being pushed to the side because Washington is kind of also done with the Lebanese government, who was supposed to have already disarmed Hezbollah. But, to be fair, you hear from the Lebanese government who says that they never got the proper support from the US to properly arm the Lebanese army, to properly, equip the Lebanese army to take on the task of disarming Hezbollah. So it's a kind of like a finger-pointing situation all around. I think for the foreseeable future, Lebanon may be sidelined. I'm hoping France's initiative might, lead to some kind of breakthrough, or that if Trump was actually in talks with Iran, as he posted today, that Lebanon would be part of an eventual deal.
I would say, what diplomacy? What about the past 3 years, if not longer, has led us to have any faith in negotiations in which Israel was involved? The statements I get from various Israeli ministries that cause me to immediately talk to my editors are the Ministry of Defense and the Prime Minister's office. The Foreign Ministry, as far as I can tell, is sort of sending out clips from the sites of Iranian missile impacts during this war and trolling Western ambassadors in Israel, like Gideon Saar, the foreign minister, did of the German ambassador here recently, who was talking about a massive rise in settler violence. Before the war, there was sort of reports in the Israeli media, and we were hearing the same thing, that like, look, Israel wants to engage with this sort of US overseen process to bolster the Lebanese government. And it sort of got some people's hopes up that there might be a diplomatic path forward. But looking at what's going on in Lebanon now, with such a massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, you really find it very hard to think that that sort of diplomatic spirit is front and center.
Tom, given the destruction in Lebanon, like you described, the strikes on Iran, obviously we had that really big one at the beginning that caught global attention, the one on the school in Iran, but also, the arson attacks that are still happening in the West Bank and still continuous strikes on Gaza. Would you say Israel right now is losing global narrative?
I think it has been throughout. I mean, it's really interesting to see how this all started with the October 7 attacks, a moment after which there was huge global solidarity with Israel because of the brutality of that assault. And now we look where we are now, and it's a complete about turn. I mean, I think my impression of this is less interesting. Let's just look at what the in particular the alternative American media has been saying. I mean, that Tucker Carlson interview with Joe Kent, it was just astonishing. Like some of the most powerful media figures meeting some of a key Trump MAGA official, going on seriously critical stuff of Israel that will talk directly to massive frustration in the MAGA camp about yet another foreign war. I think Israel is losing a lot of support, and I'm always quite interested at how I don't hear many Israelis talking about that as a huge national security problem. There are certainly people, some of the smartest and most astute people I speak to here say, look, I don't know why we're not thinking about this. Losing in particular the younger generation in the West in particular, and in particular in the US, is a huge problem. But I don't think, from what I can see, the government is in any way changing its behavior to try and win back some sort of moral high ground here.
Sorry to jump in. I just wanted to add one thing to what Tom and I were saying previously on negotiations with Lebanon or a solution with Lebanon. I think it's important also to note that there was a ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel that came into effect in November 2024, and that was US mediated. There was a whole ceasefire monitoring committee led by the US, led by France. There was Israeli officials sort of overlooking. And I think it's very important to note that for that entire ceasefire, Israel was violating the agreement on a near daily basis. There were near daily strikes on Lebanon South, and Beirut, across the country, across what Israel says were Hezbollah targets. But when we would go on ground to cover, the evidence was barely there. And, you had more than 100 civilians were killed according to UN numbers. It was just warfare all around. So I don't think the ceasefire in Lebanon was ever two-sided. I think it was very much one-sided according to legal experts. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we speak of a diplomatic solution now, because any sort of ceasefire that should come into effect now, or any kind of agreement that should come into effect now, should be respected by both parties for long-term, security. So this does not happen again and again, and we're not stuck in a loop.
Yeah, very good point, because we already had a ceasefire, like you said, in Lebanon. And interestingly, one that Iran always used as a reference after the June war last year, saying, we're not going to be another Lebanon and we don't want a ceasefire like that. I'll just take one final question from the audience. I believe we have answered most of them. Fatima, I'll come to you with this, because this is something that we always discuss. What role is Oman playing at the moment?
Oman is a very interesting case, at least for me personally, because I was covering the nuclear talks that were happening, mediated by Oman before the war happened. And I think Oman, which is a very it's a country, it's a country that doesn't make a lot of noise, I would say, in the global or the public sphere, but especially in the US-Iran talks and in the days leading up to the war, and especially now, they've been very outspoken on how avoidable this war had been. So just one day before, so I remember very well the talks, the last round of talks happened in Geneva on a Thursday. The Omani foreign minister was there. He put out a post after saying that there significant progress was being made. A deal was within reach. On Friday, the Omani foreign minister traveled to the US. He gave a interview on US media, which is very rare for the Omanis, if you know. Very rare media interview in which he was speaking about, again, a deal was on the table, a deal was within reach, that they had made significant progress, and that conflict and fighting, despite the rising tensions, was avoidable. The very next day, Mr. Trump declares war on Iran, wages war on Iran, both Israel and the US. And since then, we've had several statements by the Omanis saying, again, this was, the US and Israel waged war on Iran, regardless of, obviously Iran's retaliation on the region, on its neighbors, on Gulf states. Nothing justifies that. But if, again, it's chicken or egg, you go back to the original sparking point of this regional escalation, and they would say it was the US and Israel who struck Iran first. Now, the Omanis are still obviously calling for de-escalation. I don't know how involved they are in trying to mediate talks again, because this would be the second time that they mediate talks, and then in the middle of the talks are derailed, their efforts are gone to waste. So I don't know how involved they are at the moment in kickstarting talks again, but they're definitely very vocal about calling for de-escalation, and definitely very vocal about how this was a war that could have been avoided all around, and very vocal in blaming Israel basically for dragging the US into this war.
Thank you, Fatima. Just to end, because I realize we've already hit the hour mark. It's very difficult for us, unfortunately, to be able to give the audience an exact idea of when this will end. These are the questions that we usually get, but I think we can sort of look at a scenarios-based sort of situation. What would a ceasefire look like? What would happen to the Strait of Hormuz? In light of also what Trump was saying about speaking to, I just saw now that he's currently speaking to reporters saying that he spoke with a respected Iranian leader. He didn't say who, so we don't know exactly who he's spoken to. But yeah, just sort of, what do you think would end this war? How would an end to this war look, and what would come after?
It's hard to imagine the Strait of Hormuz opening before the end of the war, because that would be a sort of capitulation by the Iranians, and that's their key bargaining chip, along with being able to strike, particularly the Gulf states, or try to. So a lot of it will come down to at what point America think that they've delivered enough of a bloody nose to say, well, mission accomplished. Let's draw this down. It also remains to be seen what Israel would be satisfied with, because we could be in a scenario where the US calls it a day and Israel doesn't. That is possible. But the Strait of Hormuz and the global energy situation will be key to all of this.
Yeah, as Anthony Blinken said, it's the two M's, markets and munitions, that will see the end of the war.
Tom, Fatima, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, no denying that the majority of Jewish Israelis at least view Iran as a massive threat, and that's why I think this is basically the only country where the population is overwhelmingly supportive of the war. I think with that in mind, the overall wish is to see Iran as a threat greatly diminished. Now, at the moment, I suppose there are many Israelis who wanted that to take the form of a popular uprising that would produce a pro-Western, pro-Israel government in Iran, that looks very distant now. And the fear is that for someone like Mr. Netanyahu, chaos in Iran serves Israel quite well, because while it would be devastating for the region and markets, at least the threat to Israel would be diminished. There's also the cynical argument that Netanyahu is doing this to drum up political support, to divert attention from his corruption trial. So again, no real certainties there. But I think for most Israelis, the priority is reducing and, if possible, ending the nuclear and ballistic missile and proxy threat that Iran faces. There's just no real idea about how they might go about that.
I would say I'm a bit more cynical, because we're hearing from President Trump now say that they reached an agreement with the Iranians, and that it's a deal that Israel will like, and that he spoke to, like you said, Abin, with a top U official, and that a deal has been, or a deal at least is in the making. But we have to keep in mind that this has happened at least twice before. It happened last June when they were having talks. I mean, they never claimed that a deal had happened back then, but there were talks, progress was being made. You hear it from, again, Oman, the mediator, a third party, and then again earlier this year. So a bit more cynical. I mean, after covering 3 rounds of talks, I don't know how much. I mean, I really hope that this would signal an end, but like Thomas said, basically, it's never the civilian toll that brings an end to wars, and it's really unfortunate, because I think this is one of the most large-scale impacts we've seen. I think the death toll across the Middle East has surpassed 4,000, and it really is a shame that this was an aimless war to start with. So yeah, let's see what comes out of the talks, and hopefully third time's the charm.
There is a scenario in which the US walks away, Israel has enough, and the hardliners in Iran continue in place. And just to mention, that is something that the Gulf may find a situation the Gulf may find itself in, having to deal with an Iran that's been emboldened, that claims it's won, and that the regime sticks around, and that the Gulf states have to look at a sort of new reality dealing with this kind of Iran in some sort of continuing form.
Yeah, definitely. And as Fatima said, we've been in this point before where Mr. Trump comes and says that talks are happening. At the end of the day, he's at war with the country while also easing sanctions on its oil. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And thank you to my colleagues for taking their time once again to join us for this discussion. And we will keep them coming. Please do send any questions or any topics that you'd like us to touch upon. And please do keep following the National's excellent coverage. Thank you so much.